Yes, I'd much prefer to come in with low expectations, but there we are. Oh, I'm liking today. It's good. Brought people up with baptisms. It's all full out there. It's all full up there. It's very good. So hello again. Apologies if you're already getting bored of me. Sorry, it's just the way today panned out. We just heard the reading. That's going to be the reading that we're looking at this morning, because there are passages in the Bible that are problematic, is a good word. There are bits where people do things or they say things that are difficult for us to understand or that seem out of character, and it's tricky. It's tricky if you're, I mean, I'm assuming for you it's tricky. It's definitely tricky for me, because I like things to make sense. I like them to sit together harmoniously. I like that if someone behaves in a certain way, that they generally carry on behaving in that way and don't do things that I don't understand, because that bothers me. But conversely, I quite like these difficult passages. I like them because I find them a challenge. Why did the author include it? Why have they put it in there if it's difficult? Why didn't they just leave it out and make everyone's life easier? Is it deliberately there to stir the pot and wind us up? Or does the passage carry maybe a more complicated meaning? One that we have to do a little bit of work to uncover. Anybody here ever read The Famous Five? Got any Famous Five readers? I feel like it sweeps across a certain generation of people, and then a few, I read it to my kids, and I've heard my parents talk about that. I read them all once. I was ill for about a fortnight, and someone brought around a carrier bag just full of Famous Five, and I worked through the whole lot. Very similar to each other, got to be honest. A lot of smugglers were involved. Also much ginger beer and cycling around. Also, they go on an adventure every summer holiday, 21 summer holidays in a row. And talking of problematic things, that. Anyway, if you're familiar with The Famous Five, or if you're not, either way, it's a group of children. There's only 4 children and a dog called Timmy. And the 4 children are Julian, Dick, George, and Anne. But George, confusingly, sounds like a boy, but is in fact a girl called Georgina. But she doesn't like that she's a girl, and she doesn't like that she's called Georgina, and chooses always to go by the name George. In one adventure, Famous Five are probably on Kieran Island, just at a guess, and there's probably some smugglers, as I recall, and George is captured by the smugglers in the tunnel. And when the smugglers discover that there are 3 other children above ground, they come up with a brilliant plan that George should write a note to the other children saying, why don't you come down into the dark underground tunnels that are creepy but totally safe? You should all come, and don't tell anyone where you're going. And then she signs it. But she signs it Georgina, rather than George. And when the Famous Five get the note, they're all like, hang on a minute. She never calls herself Georgina. She only ever calls herself George. Something is up. And using their amazing crime-solving skills, they defeat the smugglers, and the police arrest them. Because they looked at it and went, that's wrong. That's a clue. That is a clue, because it's Enid Blyton. And that's going to change how we read everything else in this note. Now, I'm telling you this, not only because I like The Famous Five, but because that's kind of what we've got going on here. I mean, this is a strange passage to us. Let's be honest, we've just had Jesus refer to a woman as a dog. That's not Jesus's style. That is very out of character for Jesus, which is our clue. That's our clue. What's going on here? This is not how Jesus talks. We know that. We know that from his ministry, from his teaching, from his life. This is not what it looks like at first. There must be something for us to dig into. What's going on? So, this episode is set in Tyre, which is now Lebanon. We're outside of Judea. We're outside of Israel. We're outside of Galilee, which is the bit where if you're a Jew, you kind of mix with the Gentiles a bit more. Galilee's a bit wild like that. But we've gone even further north to Tyre and Sidon. And this is like full-on Gentile country. We are out in the foreign wilds at this point. And whilst there, Jesus meets this woman. And immediately we're reminded how much of an outsider she is. She's a woman, which in that culture at that time meant that she was not a man. She was not as good as a man. She was outside. Not saying that's how it is now, shouldn't be, but that's what it was at the time. She is a Syro-Phoenician, so she's a foreigner. She's an outsider. She's Greek, which is another way of saying she's Gentile or not Jewish. She's an outsider. And this one's slightly more tenuous. It doesn't mention it either way, but we don't hear about a husband. We hear about a daughter, we hear about the woman, no mention of a husband, so it's possible, no more than that she's a widow. Again, that would make her even more of an outsider. She is very definitely in the not one of us crowd. But despite that, she recognizes Jesus, she acknowledges his power, and she begs him to drive the demon out of her daughter. And that's where Jesus says the strange thing. He says, first, let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Which, in a rough translation, essentially means, go away, you foreign woman. You are not one of God's chosen children, and the good news of the gospel is not for you yet. It's quite harsh. Now, I've tried to be kind, I've tried to soften it slightly. I've dropped the yet in on the end, because that's kind of what happens. What we know that they don't know at this point is that after Jesus dies on the cross and comes back, he's going to do that whole thing about take the message to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the whole world. But we've not had that yet. At this point in Jesus' ministry, it's all very Israel-centric. It's all about God's people and God's nation. It's not yet for the outsiders. If you read all this in Matthew's gospel, it becomes even more obvious because that's one of Matthew's interests. And it kind of makes sense to us because Israel is God's chosen people. They are the special ones. The point of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, going all the way back, is that they are in covenant with God to demonstrate what being in relationship with God should look like. The idea was that nations of the world would look at Israel and go, wow, look how peacefully and prosperously they live because they follow the teachings of God. Their relationship with him means their life is amazing. We should do that too. And we also know, because if you've read the Old Testament, this is a little bit of a recurring theme, that doesn't actually work. The nation of Israel mess up and make mistakes and break the covenant, and it is a disaster. They are not the shining example and beacon that perhaps they could have been. And so Jesus, in the first instance, comes to fix that. He comes to go, right, let's sort out Israel and the Jewish nation and those people so that they can go back to being what they were intended to be. And that's why he says, but it's for the children. But it's still a harsh thing to say. It's still too harsh. We need to dig a little bit more. So here's another thing. It seems likely, having kind of checked with a few scholars and commentaries and so on, that this is not just an off-the-cuff remark that Jesus makes. He's quoting a proverb. Not a proverb, capital P, out of the book in the Bible, just a proverb, like bird in the hand worth two in the bush, that kind of thing. A general saying that people at the time would know and would use. It's intended to comment on the appropriateness of a particular action. He's using a proverb. And he uses it because it does a couple of things. Partly, it acts as a summary of everything that we've been talking about so far. I say we, me, but I'm trying to make it feel inclusive. But that's been talked about so far this morning. We've talked about the in-group and the out-group. That's there in this proverb. Jesus and the woman stand on opposite sides of that divide. One is in, one is out. And Jesus is acknowledging that this is the accepted cultural position. This is how people in the world are going to look at this situation. Now, it's not to say that Jesus agrees with it. He's not saying, oh, thank goodness. He's saying, this is the situation. Because it's important to be aware of how the world is. And Jesus is. But then secondly, and this is where it becomes important, this proverb is a reminder that the woman is not entitled, and I kind of want to use air quotes quite significantly here. The woman is not entitled to receive God's healing for her daughter. It's not hers by right. She is not one of the children of God. She is not Jewish. She is not under covenant with God. That's been made very clear to us at the start of the story. She doesn't have a right to receive this. The best way I can kind of phrase, best way I can think of to put this is that I've got two sons. I've got Reuben and Ezra, who are over there at the moment, enjoying themselves with trains. I have a responsibility for them. Right? I mean, I share that with Abby, but for the purposes of clarity, I have a responsibility for them. Right? It is my responsibility to ensure that they are looked after, that they are fed. If I do not feed them, then I very quickly get in trouble with a lot of people. Them, Abby, social services, it spirals very quickly because that's my responsibility. I do not have, in the same way, a responsibility towards other people's children. I don't have to ensure that they are fed. Now, there will be situations in which not stepping in at that moment when a child needs feeding would make me a terrible, terrible human being. So I'm not saying, forget everyone, but in terms of our responsibility, if a child comes to my table and sits down to eat, only those two get the right to say, you've got to feed me. Everyone else is dependent on my generosity. Everyone else, to use a more biblical term, is dependent on my grace. And that is what's happening here in this Bible story with Jesus and the woman. We see it in her response because she says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. What she's saying is that whilst the outsider might not be entitled, they can still be a recipient of grace, which I think is entirely the point of grace, isn't it? I don't know if you've come across it. There's that lovely thing that mercy is not getting what we do deserve, and grace is getting what we don't deserve. The whole point of grace is that we don't deserve it. We can't deserve it. We get it anyway. That's what makes it grace. We've had a baptism this morning. You know, this baptism is about Charlotte's relationship with Jesus. Not something that she's earned. It's not like you've ticked enough boxes now, well done, you've qualified for baptism. It's God saying, by grace, be in relationship with me. Which is how it should be. It shouldn't be it's not a reward. It's just have it anyway. Charlotte is here by grace. And that might lead us to misunderstand Jesus' response. If we don't get this about grace, we might misunderstand when Jesus replies, because Jesus says, for your reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. This is not because Jesus is impressed with a witty retort. I've seen it talked about that way sometimes. They go, oh, look at how clever the woman is. She takes Jesus' words, she twists them around, she reverses it, she outwits him, and he goes, oh, well done, clever woman. You've outbantered me. Here, have some healing. You deserve it. No. Jesus is not there going, see if you can impress me. See if you can do a witty enough comeback. Of course he isn't. Jesus says, I see that you get it. I see that you understand, that you have faith, that you understand what grace is. You understand the nature of God and the nature of his love for people, for all people. Because this woman, this outsider, this Gentile, she is saying, I know that I am not entitled, but I also know that you are gracious, and I appeal to your grace in my time of need. This woman gets it. She gets what grace is, and that's what Jesus is responding to, her faith and her understanding. She knows that God's grace is so abundant that it just spills over, that it cannot be contained. That even if it is intended for the children, there's enough for everyone. The woman gets it, Jesus sees that she gets it, her daughter is healed. Now, normally at this point, I'd look to conclude with some kind of application. Right? Here's what we've talked about from the Bible. It's all been very jolly and hopefully very interesting. But what does that mean for real life? Here's how we can go and do something with that. Today, I want to go more with a reminder of our obligations. Now, to be clear, this is not because I think that we have failed to meet them. I'm not standing here going like that. I realise that my tone occasionally goes that way. I apologise if that's the case. This is not that. This is me simply saying sometimes we all, and I really include myself in this, we all need a reminder of who we are and where we are and how things are. At the start of this year, there were over 80 million displaced people in the world. Displaced people is a phrase that means either you're a refugee or you're an asylum seeker, or you cannot go back to your own home even within your country. If you've been driven out of your home by war, then you are internally displaced. And there are, of those 80 odd million, 48 million are internally displaced. In Syria, for example. There are another 30 million who are either refugees or asylum seekers. And given that these numbers are based on the start of this year, 9 months ago, I'm fairly confident, sadly, that they will have gone up quite dramatically, at least in the last month, because of what's going on in Afghanistan. And just to help us understand one more thing, because you might be wondering, okay, there's 30 million of these asylum seekers and refugees. How many of them are here? The answer is only just over 200,000, which on the scale of things is peanuts. It's nothing. It's less than 1%. It's about 0.7% of all asylum seekers and refugees. It's about 0.3%, less than 0.5% of the population of this country. And I mention that because when it comes to refugees, there are voices, there are loud voices in this country that are determined to remind us that they are outsiders, that they are not us, that they are not entitled to our help or our support, that they should be left to drown in the Channel or sent back to the war zones that they have fled from, told to go back and be hunted down because they're not us and because they're not entitled. Those voices are wrong. Because we look at the Bible, and the Bible says to us this, it says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Even the dogs under the table get the crumbs. As a church, as a community of Christ followers, there is only ever one voice that we should listen to. And that is the voice that says, it doesn't matter what you are entitled to. It doesn't matter what you are not entitled to. Here is grace. Everything that we have only by grace. And I know some of you will think, but I have worked hard for what I have, and that is true. But haven't we had the grace to have jobs, and the grace to have the health to work at them, and the grace to live in a peaceful country where after doing all that work, we get to keep what we have and pass it on to our families. Isn't that grace? Everything we have comes by grace. And so let's never forget, let's never refuse to extend that grace to those around us, to the outsiders and the foreigners and the widows and the orphans and the homeless and the displaced and the refugees. Because in Jesus, there are no longer outsiders. There are only people that we love. So let's show them that grace. John's letter, I think, puts this far better than I can. And Sarah's just going to come and read it for us. So John? James.
Yeah, when we said John's letter, we meant James, but that's good. James 2. My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbour as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. And that's a great way to summarize what Dave's challenged us with this morning, isn't it? That challenge to be people whose faith is a faith of action and of doing, as well as a faith of believing and speaking out what we believe to be true. And next week,